All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate every one of you for being members and supporting the work that we do every day. We truly could not do any of this without all of you. So thank you for being here and thank you for supporting us through your membership. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the months of effort that went into this exhibition by my fellow staff members. There was a lot of heavy lifting that went into this and every exhibition. In this case, it's about 18,000 pounds of heavy lifting. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to all my colleagues as well. So tonight, I'm going to attempt to answer that big so what question, or at least as much as I can do that in 30 minutes. Rodin's works are recognizable to the point that they have been memed and parodied, which of course is that truest, status symbol, right? But what is it about Rodin's work that makes it so that gives it that staying power? How does it fit into the larger history of Western art? So that's what we'll try to talk about tonight. So here we have the focus for tonight's talk and for one of our two new exhibitions, François Auguste Rodin, or just Rodin for our purposes. So if I asked you to picture a 19th century artist, a French artist, you would probably imagine someone like this, right? Long beard, beret, he's got the stains on his smock, gruff kind of expression, he's almost a cliche, right? But in many ways, Rodin was the quintessential French artist. He had dalliances with younger artists and models. He ran in circles with writers and musicians. But at the same time, his work was also completely innovative, right? Unlike anything that had really come before it. And so it's really his work that kind of pointed to the advent of modernism in Western sculpture. So when Rodin was born, Paris in 1840 looked like this. So he was born in between one of many French revolutions, just before the dawn of haussmannisation, which would see the widening and the gentrifying of the streets of Paris. He came into his own during France's Third Republic, so he died just at the end of World War I, as airplanes and tanks were decimating Europe. So as you can imagine, so much change during his lifetime, not just in Europe and in the world, but in the art world as well. So when we think of modern art in the West, we often think of painting, right? Monet, Van Gogh, Picasso, these are the names that tend to come to mind. So why are there comparatively few sculptors that we think of when we think of modern art? Well, for one, the Academy, and the French Academy particularly, and the Salon system was very hierarchical, and they really prioritized paintings. There was even a hierarchy of just genres of paintings. And sculpture was really lower on the totem pole. So sculptors were sometimes looked down on as intellectually coarse or, just laborers because they used their hands. And many well-known artists of the day, like Géricault or Daumier, actually tried their hand at sculpture but ended up going back to painting and printmaking. There was also a long apprenticeship that was necessary to do this. There was a lot of manual labor involved. You needed a whole team of artisans and craftspeople, and of course the materials and the associated costs with those. Bronze is not cheap. So there's a lot of effort and a lot of materials and things that go into being a sculptor. Here, by the way, we see Camille Claudel, who was once a member of Rodin's team and a sculptor in her own right. For a time, she was Rodin's collaborator and companion, and she herself has a fascinating story, but unfortunately, we won't have time to delve too much into her tonight. So often when we think of modernism, we think of it in terms of painting. And in the history of Western art, we think of, Monet, Gauguin, Matisse, these kinds of seminal figures. Perhaps it's not as obvious to see these kinds of shifts in sculpture, though. We don't have these same kinds of bright colors and exaggerated shapes that we see in Cubism or abstraction. They seem a little more dramatic. But if we look for a parallel in painting to Rodin, I would suggest Cézanne. In him, we have that seminal figure who was really innovative in his style. He embraced that kind of flattening of space and breaking down of the picture plane that would really open the door to ideas like Cubism and Futurism. And I would argue that Rodin was that key figure in sculpture. So he is really that person who's the transition from the old ways to ushering in that modern idea of expression. So now what we'll do is just examine a few of those factors that contributed to Rodin's style, while also looking at some of the various ways that his work was innovative and what those implications were for future generations of artists. So who was Rodin? How did he become the artist that we now associate with these monumental works of art? Well, very briefly, I'll give just a short synopsis of his life. Rodin, starting out, was not an excellent student. He struggled in school throughout his life. He routinely didn't do well with spelling or grammar. He was much more concerned with expressing himself in other ways. He attempted and failed the entrance exam to the École des Beaux-Arts not once but 3 times. He did eventually attend the Petite École des Beaux-Arts, but that was really considered more for artisans rather than artists. But I do wonder if it was not, and perhaps in part because he was not classically trained, that Rodin was not beholden to one particular movement or style. He was definitely aware of these other styles that were happening around him, Art Nouveau, for instance, but he didn't feel compelled to follow these particular trends. He had little interest in Art Nouveau. He didn't feel compelled to feign interest in things that didn't interest him. He was very eclectic in his influences. So he developed his own artistic education, really by studying from old masters at the Louvre, as so many artists have done, but also by traveling to London and Italy and other places, and of course by observing the world around him. But he really didn't limit his sources of inspiration to just art. He was, there's nature, of course, but he was also inspired by all sorts of things: Baudelaire, Javanese dance, Beethoven. He was really interested in anything and everything he could get his hands on that really inspired him. He was no stranger to scandal in his career. There was certainly, his work was not without criticism. We'll see later a work that was variously compared to a snowman and a larva, so stay tuned for that. But perhaps also it's this lack of formal training in so-called fine art that made Rodin feel that he didn't have to limit himself to just reproducing pieces in the expected way or in the styles of what he had seen before. So he really embraced new ideas, and like a lot of original thinkers, his work was not often appreciated or understood by everyone in his day. All right, so now how did all of these interests and influences and ideas really coalesce to bring together the work that places Rodin at that transitional moment at the start of modernism? So to do that, we're going to take a look at several pieces that capture various aspects of what really made Rodin's work stand apart. So one of the earliest of Rodin's creations, and I would argue one of the most important, thinking about the breadth of his career, was Man with a Broken Nose. So the subject here is a man named Bibi. He was a handyman. He did odd jobs in the neighborhood. And Rodin just said that he liked the shape of his head, and he decided to sculpt him. So just to give you a sense of what sculpture looks like at this time, we'll take a look at some of the sculptures that were in the Salon of 1864. So the Salon, of course, is the annual exhibition that the French Academy would hold to kind of tell the world what they thought fine art should look like. The Academy, as I've said, had a rigid hierarchy. They often took kind of a narrow view of what they considered art that was worthy to be presented in its annual exhibition. And as you can see here, these pieces are fairly traditional. These are kind of an expected approach for depicting heroic-looking figures. So this is kind of what the landscape of sculpture is like as Rodin is starting out. So in the example of Bibi, we have a historical connection for Rodin as well. So the treatment of this sculpture is very similar to Roman sculpture. So a lot like the ones that he would have seen in the Louvre or the British Museum. They were often very realistic, very serious kinds of portraits, and usually of real people, actual portraiture, not just an imagined idea, but an actual person, often of the higher classes, so perhaps a nobleman or an emperor or someone along those lines. Many of these often had chipped or broken noses as well, so it's interesting that he chose a subject that had that similar kind of look. So this treatment, though, choosing to kind of elevate the status of a handyman or just kind of an everyday laborer in this sort of Roman sensibility, places Rodin's work in similar vein to realist artists like Courbet and Millet and Daumier, artists who were really trying to highlight the dignity of the worker and the dignity of manual labor. And later Van Gogh, and in the US, artists in the Ashcan school would kind of take up that same mantle of representing the working class, these everyday people. So in a way, Rodin is kind of doing the same thing here with Bibi. So what really sets this sculpture apart from others in Rodin's early days is one of those little happy accidents that just happened to become a kind of a watershed moment in his career. So Rodin was working in his studio. He was fairly young still. He couldn't afford to heat his studio all the time. And it was a particularly cold winter. So he would take to, as you have to do if you're modeling in clay, you have to keep it wet so that it doesn't dry out. So he would wet a towel or something and put it over it, cover the sculpture, and leave it overnight. Well, it was particularly cold this year. And so one night, part of the sculpture, the back of the head froze, broke off, and shattered on the ground. So Rodin comes back to find his piece the next day, in many pieces. And, many sculptors might take that as an unfortunate or costly mishap. They might start over. But Rodin chose to see this as a pivotal moment and chose to see it as an opportunity. So he saw the value in that damage as kind of its own element of the piece. And he's really here rejecting the notion that sculpture has to look finished and polished. So he ended up making a plaster version of this and submitting it to the Salon, that very same Salon we saw images from a moment ago. This epiphany, though, was evidently unappreciated by the Salon. They rejected it, not just once, but twice, this subsequent year as well. But, in the same way that poetry really forces you to pare down language and just keep only what's essential, Rodin was really doing the same thing here. And he's really asking himself, what's truly vital in sculpture? What can we remove while still preserving the essence of what this piece of art is? And this is the question that he would return to again and again in his career. It also kind of prefigured these much later movements. So like Duchamp's embrace of the accidental crack that happened in the piece we call The Large Glass. Just that general acceptance of the element of chance that we see in Dadaism, whether that's using random words to create poetry or dropping bits of paper onto a canvas and just letting them sit where they land. It's also what we see in abstract expressionists who rely on the force of gravity to let these drips and drabs kind of fall onto the canvas where they may. So if you're interested in that, we have a whole gallery devoted to chance in art. It's just something that would be prefigured in a way by Rodin's work. So Man with the Broken Nose was just the beginning of this kind of exploration for Rodin. And undoubtedly some of that inspiration was derived from these classical Greco-Roman examples that he would have seen again at the Louvre or other museums, but also in his own personal collections, which you can see an image of here. He had much more than this. This is just one snapshot of part of his collection. But of course, these pieces were never intended by their creators to be seen this way. Now we're used to seeing them without limbs or heads, but of course they were meant to be seen intact, just as they were meant to be covered with bright pigment. But Rodin saw these sculptures as no less inspiring for having these losses, and it really made him re-examine his own work and just really get to the heart of what a sculpture can be. So one of the first times he intentionally experiments with this idea is in this sculpture called Walking Man. And in eliminating these kind of identifying features, so there's no face, he doesn't give a title to the piece beyond Walking Man, he really is asking the question, can we read an emotion or an idea into just a part of the body, rather than relying on an expression or a title or a subject to convey that idea? So effectively, he's eliminating the subject here. So like many of Rodin's works, this would prove to be controversial. A lot of people said, that it didn't look finished. It was not universally praised when it was first exhibited. Some critics even said that it evoked unpleasant associations with mutilation. So you would find a much more positive reception in other artists, though. And I would argue that this, of all of his sculptures, this singular one may have been the most, had the most direct impact on any artists on so many artists who were to come later. One of these was, one of these was Henry Moore, who would later note, Rodin is as universal in his fragments as in the big figures, because he understood the human body so well. This is, in my opinion, the greatness of Rodin, that he could identify himself with and feel so strongly about the human body. He believed it was the basis of all sculpture, and out of the body, he could make these marvelous sculptural rhythms. So this shift really provides this sense of freedom for artists. It gives them a new way to approach the medium. It leads to a proliferation of sculptors who are starting to explore this idea without feeling like they have to be tied to a particular representation or a particular subject. And there are countless examples that bear this out. So for instance, we know that Matisse bought a model of the Walking Man as he was working on Le Cerf, the piece that you see at right. And so Matisse's figure does have a head, but you can see he's truncated the arms, has a very similar posture, that kind of sense of forward momentum. And the overall surface quality seems very much in the line of what Rodin did, and that sort of unfinished quality. And of course, we know Matisse perhaps best for his prints and his paintings, but Matisse also did use sculpture to really refine his style over time. And I think the Back series really illustrates this really nicely. So over the course of his career, he came back to this subject and continued to streamline shapes and forms in efforts to really get at what the essence of what he thought art should be. So Rodin really kind of opened the door for this sort of paring down and this simplification of sculpture. Another modern sculptor, Raymond Duchamp, this is a different Duchamp, also took advantage of the freedom offered by Rodin's earlier example. So he's eliminating the arms from his sculptures or just creating new ways of conceiving these kinds of physical forms. We see it most directly in the example at left, the torso of a young man, but then just a few years later at right, you see how his style progressed and how he's starting to bring the principles of cubism into 3 dimensions and really verging into the territory of futurism. which brings us to Boccioni, the leading sculptor of the Futurist movement. So again, he's applying those same principles. He's capturing movement, and he's really thinking about the impact of increasingly industrialized and a mechanized world, but he's applying that to the human form. And you can see the pose here comes directly from Rodin, right? The spread legs, the forward-moving gesture of a figure. But he's taken Rodin's surface quality to a whole new level. He's really abstracting it and creating these really heightened angular forms just to really amp up that sense of motion and dynamic movement. So both Boccioni and Rodin are really interested in that idea of movement. They're just coming at it from different styles, but still using kind of a really similar vocabulary in terms of the human form. Another example of Rodin's here, which this one is not in the exhibition, but I think it illustrates nicely how we can see his impulse to simplify, not just in terms of the physical form, but even the modeling of the surfaces themselves. And again, this had a direct impact on later artists. So here we have an example by Brancusi. He actually worked briefly in Rodin's studio under him. He left pretty quickly, and it wasn't because he was not taken with the sculptor, quite the contrary. It was actually because he sensed that Rodin's creative impulse was so great that it wouldn't allow any room for him to find his own voice. He famously said that nothing grows in the shade of a tall tree. And so he went on to forge his own path. But still, I think you can see here how he translated Rodin's notions into this more modernist aesthetic, really moving further towards full abstraction. And even today, we can see how this legacy has carried through. So even though Catlett is, of course, referencing much earlier Greek and Roman sculpture, we can also trace back the origins to Rodin, who really opened the door to these possibilities and provided this sense of fragmentation and what sculpture could be. So it's kind of addition by subtraction in a way, right? So Rodin, of course, is also looking to artists who came before him. And this ranged from antiquity all the way up to the Baroque. And of these artists, Rodin was undoubtedly impacted the most by Michelangelo. His first trip to Italy in 1875 was revelatory for him. He sketched the artist's sculptures as well as his drawings and paintings in Florence and in Rome. So today we tend to think of Michelangelo as, an understood and established master of his craft. But really, in the French tradition, Michelangelo had not totally found universal approval at this time. Many classically trained artists actually preferred Raphael and his kind of softer approach to that classical subject matter. And artists who came after him, like Poussin, who was kind of the consummate academic artist and really known for his history paintings with classical themes, everything that was very sanctioned by the Salon. So for Rodin, Michelangelo provided a different path. Later in life, he even went as far as to say, "My liberation from academicism was via Michelangelo." So in other words, he really just felt empowered to steer his artwork in a different direction than the current trends that were dominating the Salon. So Rodin was really impressed by the deep emotion he saw in Michelangelo's work, the contorted poses, and just that general non finito or unfinished quality that he really saw in this Renaissance artist's work. And we see this quality of non finito again and again in Rodin's sculpture. Whether that's, that half-broken sculpture that he submitted to the Salon, or truncating a human figure, or even just in the rough surfaces of the sculptures themselves. But Rodin was no stranger to exhibiting works that were in process. He often would show a plaster model of something that he was working on. So, it might be suggested perhaps this is a study for another piece. But we know that he considered it a finished piece as well because he cast it in bronze. So he set that whole chain in motion for that process to happen, to actually cast the piece in bronze, noting to us that this is something he considered a finished piece. But this unfinished kind of quality, of course, provoked negative comments from critics. And, again, this is something that was not new for Rodin or other artists of his time. Claude Monet created paintings that drew that same kind of criticism, and I'm sure that comparison was not lost on Rodin. So one of the realities of being a working artist is, whether it's now or in the late 19th century, is that you have to sell your art if you want to support yourself. So often for sculptors, that meant either entering competitions for public pieces or getting commissions for portraits from wealthy patrons or organizations. Rodin did both, although he didn't necessarily always enjoy the latter. He found it difficult to work with clients who often found it unpleasant to be depicted authentically. So, as you can imagine, when a subject is a beloved author or a national hero, the pressure is that much greater to scrutinize and invite that kind of criticism to your work. And this is the position that Rodin found himself in when he was selected to create a piece to memorialize Honoré de Balzac 40 years after his death. So he knew that Balzac himself would not see the piece, but certainly there were many of his fans and devotees who would. And this is made all the more difficult when your subject is, shall we say, not considered conventionally attractive by most. This was made very clear in the many, many caricatures and cartoons that immortalized this author. The one at right was evidently done by a good friend of Balzac, so I guess he must have had a good sense of humor about it. So Rodin's initial approach to this subject was to learn everything that he could about Balzac. He read everything he could get his hands on. He even went as far as to go visit his tailor to see what his measurements were. But he soon abandoned this kind of naturalistic approach. Rodin's work often, almost always, evolved over time. So the project never ended up the same way that it started out. So he really realized that he wanted to kind of represent his character rather than his physical appearance. So eventually, Rodin determined that he would try to show the great laborer who, haunted by an idea in the night, arose in order to record at his desk. And that might make you think that Balzac here is in a bathrobe. You're close, but this is actually the robes of a Dominican monk, which is apparently what Balzac would wear to do his work, to write at his desk. So Rodin was kind of depicting him in that moment. So the choice of garment, it tells you about Rodin's desire to show the artist at work, the author at work in this case, but it also gives it this kind of timeless quality, right? He's not in the garment of a particular period. So I think it's interesting that Rodin characterizes him as a laborer rather than as a genius, which certainly many critics would have called him. But the word genius, I think, implies kind of a divine gift. And it doesn't acknowledge that like the word laborer, that creating something great demands hard work. And I think Rodin really understood that notion. So I think the fact that he chose to highlight him as a laborer specifically is a deliberate choice. So in both the preliminary versions that Rodin references here, he's talking about work, right? So whether it's in the robes that we know that Balzac wore to write in, or whether it's the figure at left. And Rodin did very often create nude models to study from, even if he knew that the final figure would not be clothed. So his kind of solid build, a little portly maybe, but that kind of solidity is really exaggerated by his wide stance. It gives him kind of the character of an athlete, maybe like the build of a boxer, but it makes him look like a fighter or a worker. And I think this is kind of in line with the persona that Balzac was trying to create of himself. He liked to reference rolling up his sleeves, and he was certainly a champion of the working classes. I think it is funny though. One critic pointed out that was a little bit hard to swallow, coming from someone who once, quote, was prostrated for a month by a muscle pulled while jumping a mud puddle. So I'm not sure how much of a laborer or an athlete he really was. But in any case, this kind of gives him that sense of being a champion for the laboring class. So that choice to really visually link him to the working class also parallels these kind of earlier or contemporary artists who are championing the working class, whether that's in writing or in works of art. But Rodin was not done. Of course, he always evolves his work over time. He creates and changes and always updates his designs. So this was what we'll call the final version of Balzac. This version was not exhibited in bronze initially, but it was shown in plaster in 1898. And as you can see kind of the starting point from the earlier piece that we saw. The head particularly has a similar expression, but he's turned it up a notch. This has a really exaggerated, angular, almost abstracted quality to it. And I think he was trying to maybe capture Balzac's belligerent nature, which is how he was described by a lot of his contemporaries. He was also said to have a kaleidoscopic face, so he's very expressive and his mood would change often. And I think it's important to remember, too, that Rodin's work would have been seen it would have been seen initially outside, so with the kind of changing light that comes with the filtering of light through the trees or the passing of clouds, or it would have been seen inside, but remember, this is before electricity was widespread, so you would have kind of the flickering of the gas light or the flame that would kind of change the way that you see the work of art, and the light would kind of impact differently over those surfaces as it changed. So that probably helped to kind of capture the expressiveness of Balzac's face, and that maybe reflected his frequent changes in mood as well. So this piece was exhibited in 1898. People hated it. They did not like this piece. To say it caused a scandal would be a huge understatement. It was, the public reaction was openly hostile. It's just a few of the words that the press used to describe it. It was compared to a larva, a sack of flour, a fetus, a snowman, a side of beef, and a mistake. Not favorable. It made such a splash that it was reported in newspapers in the US, even spurring some artists and folks who were a little curious to travel to France to see the work. They had a political dimension as well, so it got wrapped up in the Dreyfus affair. So there was a whole dimension to this piece that it's hard to overstate. But this piece, for all of its detractors, really moved the needle again a little bit further towards abstraction. And a young artist who would come to study under Rodin would say it comes as near to being an abstraction as seems possible in the art of sculpture. And so we see kind of echoes of this in later works. So manipulating the human form in these kinds of sculptural portraits, as Picasso did. So Rodin's experiments with abstraction, with this different kinds of surface treatment, all of these would inform one of his biggest undertakings, which was The Gates of Hell. So oddly enough, one of the most important projects of Rodin's career, but one that would ultimately never really be finished. It would still have a profound impact on the trajectory of his career, and it would do so many things for the field of sculpture. But the project that was to create this set of monumental doors was ultimately never fulfilled. The museum was supposed to be a museum of decorative arts. Somewhat ironically, though that museum was never built on that particular site, we now have the Musée d'Orsay. So it came full circle. So the choice of the subject was not prescribed. This was a competition. But Rodin chose as his subject the gates of hell. And in choosing that, he's choosing a religious Christian subject, not a literary, a literary rather than a biblical source for this. He's using Dante's Inferno as his source of inspiration. And I say inspiration rather than illustration, and we'll see why. But, art historically speaking, it's almost impossible to think of a set of monumental doors without picturing the golden doors that grace the baptistry in Florence. So Ghiberti's example was fresh in Rodin's mind as well, having traveled to Italy. So it's no surprise that this is kind of his starting point. And you can see from the sketch on the right that initially he had imagined the doors with these similar kind of banded areas in the composition, so breaking down the picture plane into smaller areas. But he quickly abandoned that approach, and he really wanted to kind of open up the doors, and now you just see two larger panels that really free up the space that he has to create figures. And, he worked through, and what you're seeing at the right is a maquette, or one of these many models that he would create. And you can see there's not a lot of detail to it. When you go downstairs and see the piece, I urge you to get up close and notice that a lot of the figures are really not delineated very clearly, because it is a model, but it also kind of lends itself that abstract quality. So he was thinking, I think, still about Michelangelo. His work doesn't necessarily resemble Michelangelo's here, but he's still thinking about those kind of twisted, contorted figures in considering how to create this composition. So just as he would have done with his treatment of Balzac later, Rodin kind of is freeing himself from the constraints of naturalism. His work is becoming more abstracted, and you can see that in these various models, and just kind of pointing to the point that where if you see it up close, it's really hard to discern individual figures or objects at all. So Rodin is not just looking at Michelangelo. He's, of course, thinking about the source material. He was enamored of Dante, which is part of the reason he chose it as the subject. Dante was very popular at the time, even though it was several hundred years old. So he's looking to antiquity. He's looking to also more modern examples. Artists like William Blake, Gustave Doré, and later Salvador Dali all found inspiration in Dante's work. And for Rodin's part, he's really using the Divine Comedy as kind of a lens to examine the human condition. So he created hundreds of sculptures in the process of creating these models, and they really run the gamut, showing you everything from agony to ecstasy and everything in between. So in some of the pieces, so for instance, Adam was one of the figures that was to flank the doors on either side. He made kind of more overt references to these earlier examples. So for instance, we see that outstretched finger, and we of course automatically think of Michelangelo and that famous scene there. But he also continued a practice that would mark his career over and over, which was the repurposing and repeating of works of art. He was nothing if not resourceful. He had to create clay models that became plaster and as part of the casting process to create these bronzes. So he had hundreds of hands and feet and heads that he could change out and put on different bodies and repurpose. So in this version here, we're seeing a later example of a derivative of that Adam sort of posture. The pose is very similar. He's changed just a few slight things about his gesture, and then he's actually repeated that same figure 3 times to create the shades that you see on the right. So with these and so many of Rodin's pieces, what he captures so well is this sense of movement. And sometimes it's this kind of dynamic, naturalistic movement, as in the walking man we saw earlier, but sometimes it's sort of this suggestion of movement, that kind of potential energy, whether that's, the shades here that are about to descend into hell, or a coiled figure that is about to untense and stand upright. And this was a sensibility that Rodin really emphasized with his students, and there were many. There were a lot of burgeoning young artists, especially in the US, where he was very popular, who started to seek him out and really wanted to study under him. And Harriet Frischmuth was one of these. She recalled Rodin saying, "Remember that movement is the transition from one attitude to the next." And for Rodin, movement was really that vital element in sculpture. He thought that all sculptures had to have a sense of that. He also advised her to always look at the silhouette of a subject and be guided by it. And I think you can see both of these principles really on display here at this work in the right. Frischmuth often imbued her works with this graceful silhouette, thinking always about the lines that her sculptures were creating. And there's that sense of momentum, right, of what's happening and that kind of sense of what's coming next. And this particular piece is in the Siamese collection, so you can visit it in Gallery 4. All right, so the building that the gates were intended for was never built. But Rodin, even after he knew that this building was not going to be created, he continued to work on this project. It was just an eternal source of inspiration for him. And he found a lot of source material. So once he knew these weren't going to be a set of doors, he started excising pieces and using them as standalone sculptures that he could exhibit and sell. So again, very resourceful. He's always repurposing. So from this undertaking, we get some of Rodin's most enduring pieces. Of course, the thinker, who I think we're all familiar with. This was originally conceived of as the poet. So this was a reference to Dante, but again, he can just repurpose it and think about it in another kind of context. And then the kiss, which is the story of Paolo and Francesca. They're a pair of doomed lovers, and this is one of only 2 stories that actually comes from the Inferno. So when we say that he was using it as a source of inspiration rather than illustration, that's kind of what we mean. He's using it as a sort of excuse to explore all of these facets of the human condition. So when the so-called final version, there wasn't really a final because there weren't really doors, but there was one that was cast shortly after Rodin's death from kind of a later version of the model and putting some of those pieces together. You can see the thinker at the top there, just below the top lintel, and you can see a small version of it in the maquette downstairs as well. But he did a lot of things with this. Even though the doors never were actually realized, he reinvigorated an interest in relief sculpture, which had kind of stagnated. He's pushing the needle a little bit further towards abstraction with all of these models. And he inspired these works that really explore these kind of existential questions and ideas of human suffering. So the other of the 2 major works that shaped Rodin's legacy was the Burgers of Calais. And I would venture to guess, if you've heard of this story, it's probably because of Rodin, in part, because I don't think it's a particularly well-known story outside of this piece. So the story is not a literary account, it's not a biblical source. Here we're looking at a historical account. And this comes from the 100 Years' War. So this was fought in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. And essentially the city of Calais had been under siege from England for almost a year, 11 months. And at this point in the story, the burghers, the citizens of this town had gone 100 days without access to adequate food. So at this point, these 6 citizens, the burghers as we know them, stepped forward and said that they would sacrifice themselves and deliver the keys of the walls of the city to the king in order to spare the city and allow food to come in. But they knew that they themselves would be giving up their own lives. So eventually, the queen, the king's wife, talked him out of killing the the citizens. But this is crucially, Rodin has chosen that moment before they know this. So it's that moment where they are still grappling with that decision that they have made to sacrifice their lives in order to spare their fellow citizens. So I think it's worth noting here what public sculpture looked like at this time in public monuments. So the Third Republic in France saw a huge proliferation in sculpture. There was partly that was due to kind of boosting morale after a defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. It was also a nice way to decorate these newly widened streets of Paris. But that doesn't mean that the work was all groundbreaking or that it was universally beloved. A lot of this sculpture looked something like this. It was not all gold, but there was often a heroic figure. Usually they were on horseback. There was a very traditional approach to this kind of subject. So as you can imagine, the burghers, it's a totally new subject for Rodin to approach. There's no historical precedent for a monument to this group. And the city initially requested just one statue of the wealthiest burgher, the one whose name that they knew, and Rodin had a different vision. So he said, well, how about I do 6 instead? So this allowed him to, he invented their names and ages. He kind of took some liberties with who they were, but it allowed him to really represent a range of emotions. So instead of just one figure, you get all of these varied responses to the decision that they had made and what they were wrestling with. So we don't see just that same sense of unwavering courage or that strong steadfastness that we see in these sculptures on horseback, but instead we get despair or grief or anxiety or uncertainty or determination, but it's just a spectrum of emotional responses. And that really allows us as the viewer to empathize with these figures and try to really understand what they were going through and the things that must have been going through their minds. So this was such a departure from anything else that had come before it in terms of public monuments. So it's really no surprise that this kind of a groundbreaking work of art would have an impact on the art world and would affect so many younger artists. One of these was Meta Warwick Fuller, who was a young art student, and she would come to be at the fore of the Harlem Renaissance. But she met Rodin at the turn of the century. Again, she was one of these young artists who came to study under him. And she went on to create works like this one, which, again, you can see a similarly complex composition, lots of figures, and again, just exploring the depths of despair and human suffering in her work. So another way that this piece was innovative, or that it would have been innovative, was in its installation. So Rodin's request was to place the sculpture at ground level, literally on the ground, not even on a plinth or a platform. But the pedestal was the norm for all public sculpture, as we've already seen. And just any departure from that was just completely unthinkable. The city could not fathom it. So that ultimately was not how they were installed. But think about that. Rodin intended for those sculptures to be on the ground. And he wanted the viewer to be in the heart of the action, to really understand the proceedings and be in the midst of it, and be able to look at those figures in the eye and really understand their emotion and their psychological state. The grouping was finally installed on the ground, but not until after World War II, which is, of course, decades after Rodin's death in 1917. And it really wasn't until a few decades later in the 1960s that this kind of installation would really become more common and widespread. But I mean, there's no way to overstate the quality of this groundbreaking work and what a shift this was for public monuments. I would argue that we don't see this kind of dramatic impact on public monuments until Maya Lin's groundbreaking Vietnam War Memorial. So these are only some of the illustrations of Rodin's achievements in sculpture. We could go on, but like so many pivotal artists, he absorbed everything that he could. He embraced new, unfounded, untested ideas. He was open to possibilities, and he worked tirelessly. We can see his legacy in virtually every aspect of Western art in some way. So Cubists took inspiration from his kind of uneven treatment of surfaces and this kind of abstracted approach to forms. Synchromists painters, like the ones we see here, were kind of drawn to his sort of breakdown of planar forms, even though they do it in bright colors. Futurists saw his work as a way to capture motion and forward momentum. Photographers, like Alfred Stieglitz, were really inspired by his works that simplified the human form into just its expressive parts. Symbolists saw in his subjects more than meets the eye, so just thinking about what they represented. And of course, sculptors, everyone from Henry Moore to Paul Wayland Bartlett and John Storer, found so much in his work: simplicity emotion, just that inherent power of the human form. And, of course, lest we forget, Rodin's impact continues to be felt today, albeit in some surprising places. So, if we take any inspiration from Rodin, what should it be? I would say be open to every possible source. Don't put too much stock in the critics. And, of course, reduce, reuse, recycle. Thank you so much.